The first official record of humanity inside the Orinthal Compact began as a footnote in a diplomatic ledger, a single dismissive paragraph written by a junior archivist who noted that a newly discovered species from a yellow star system had achieved faster-than-light travel through what appeared to be inefficient brute force engineering, and had requested observer status rather than membership, which most of the galaxy took as confirmation of their assumed inferiority. And so when the human delegation arrived at the council spire, they were met with polite boredom rather than hostility, their ships parked in low-priority orbits while war fleets of the Kel Dominion and the Varth hierarchy loomed above in ceremonial displays of power that had been refined over millennia. And Ambassador Helen Grant noticed all of it with a calm expression that some mistook for nervousness as she walked beneath ceilings high enough to house cruisers and past alien envoys who barely bothered to translate. Their whispers, one of whom remarked that the humans looked soft, another joked that any species that still used kinetic weapons could not be taken seriously, and the presiding speaker, a many-limbed being named Trell Ka, who represented the Orinthal and whose people had once erased 3 civilizations for less than a border dispute, opened the session by reminding the chamber that humanity had been granted time only as a courtesy, and that their presence did not imply parity, a statement that was met with ritualized approval clicks and flashes from delegates who had already decided the outcome, while Grant simply nodded and said that humanity understood hierarchy and had no desire to disrupt it, a phrase that was recorded and later quoted out of context as proof that humans accepted subservience, though what she meant was far more literal, because humans had studied the compact for decades before revealing themselves, mapping trade routes, military doctrines, and response times, learning how empires rose and fell in predictable cycles, and most importantly learning that the galaxy equated restraint with weakness, a mistake humanity had made before on its own world at terrible cost. And so the humans asked for observer status not because they feared the galaxy, but because they wanted time to watch, time to learn, and time to decide whether the wider community was worth joining at all. But that patience was interpreted as submission, and within 3 cycles of that first meeting, a fringe species under compact protection, the small amphibious Lyran, sent a distress call to Earth because a Kel Dominion mining fleet had begun strip harvesting their ocean world in violation of a minor treaty clause that the Dominion knew the Council would never enforce, and when Grant brought this to the chamber, she was interrupted before finishing her second sentence. Speaker Trell Ka stating that enforcement actions were costly and that the Lyran should have negotiated better terms, prompting laughter from several warlike delegations, and Grant replied evenly that humans would extract the Lyran themselves, which caused the chamber to fall into a brief silence before erupting into amused disbelief, a Kel warlord asking if the humans intended to fight the Dominion Navy with shuttles and courage, and Grant responded that no, humanity would not fight the Dominion at all, they would simply remove the Lyran, a statement that was dismissed as impossible given the Dominion blockade. And so when the humans left the chamber, they were followed by mocking commentary feeds speculating on how long it would take for the humans to learn their place. But 72 standard hours later, the Dominion blockade around Lyran Prime went dark without a single shot recorded, their ships intact but powerless, drifting like discarded relics as human vessels passed through unchallenged and began evacuating the planet with methodical efficiency, and Dominion commanders reported total system failure caused by unknown interactions between human drives and local space-time that rendered all higher energy systems innate, a phenomenon human engineers referred to as null shadowing and had developed as a safety measure to prevent catastrophic chain reactions during experimental travel, never intended as a weapon but devastating when applied deliberately. And when the Dominion demanded explanation, the humans responded with a full technical brief that was so detailed and precise it terrified the analysts assigned to it because it implied that humanity understood not only its own technology but that of the Dominion well enough to neutralize it non-destructively, a concept that ran counter to galactic military philosophy which equated victory with annihilation. And the Council reconvened in emergency session where Speaker Trell Ka attempted to reassert authority by declaring the human action an unauthorized intervention, to which Grant replied that humanity had not intervened in compact affairs. They had simply exercised the same freedom of movement the Dominion claimed when harvesting Lyran Prime, a logical trap that left the chamber silent. And it was in that silence that the first seed of fear took root, because the humans had not threatened anyone, had not deployed visible superweapons, had not even raised their voices, yet they had accomplished what no minor species had ever done. They had acted independently against a major power and succeeded without loss. And as reports filtered in that Dominion ships across multiple sectors were experiencing unexplained system dampening when human vessels passed nearby, a pattern began to emerge that analysts struggled to accept, which was that human technology was not merely advanced but fundamentally different, built around control rather than output, restraint rather than excess. And as one Oriental strategist privately noted, any species that builds its machines to hold back its own. Power has already learned lessons others have not, and while the Council publicly downplayed the incident, behind closed doors ancient archives were opened and old warnings resurfaced, fragmented records from long-extinct civilizations that spoke of a species that fought wars against itself until it learned to fear what it could do, a species that survived by inventing rules and then inventing ways to break them safely. And for the first time since humanity's arrival, the question shifted from how to control the humans to what would happen if they ever decided to stop asking permission, a question that Ambassador Grant had anticipated from the beginning as she stood aboard the human flagship watching Lyran refugees settle into temporary habitats, knowing that the galaxy had just witnessed a kindness it did not understand and a capability it could not dismiss, and that this moment, quiet and bloodless as it was, would be remembered as the instant when the illusion finally cracked, and the aliens began to learn that humans were never the underdogs at all. The immediate aftermath of the Lyran evacuation sent ripples through the Oriental Compact that no official communique could smooth over, because while the council chambers returned to their rituals and public calm, the military and intelligence networks beneath them went into overdrive, Dominion admirals demanding to know how their fleets had been neutralized without damage, Voth analysts tearing apart sensor logs frame by frame, and even the ancient Oriental themselves quietly admitting that they had no model for what the humans had done, because nothing in recorded galactic warfare resembled an enemy who could render you harmless without ever engaging you, and this confusion was compounded by the human response, or lack of one, as Earth issued no victory statements, no ultimatums, no demands for apology or compensation. Only a short transmission to the Council stating that the Lyran were under temporary human protection, and that any attempt to interfere would be considered hostile. A sentence so calmly worded that it unsettled those who understood power, because truly dangerous species did not need to shout, and within days a Kel Dominion delegation arrived in orbit around Earth demanding reparations and explanations, their warships forming up in aggressive postures meant to intimidate, only to find themselves shadowed by human vessels that matched them silently and precisely, never crossing into threatening vectors, yet never allowing the Dominion ships to maneuver freely. A kind of polite containment that infuriated the Kel commanders who were accustomed to dominance through fear, and when their flagship captain demanded to speak to a human military authority, he was instead routed to civilian office, where a human named Daniel Ortiz, listed simply as a systems liaison, greeted him with a calm voice and explained that the human ships were there to ensure navigational safety and prevent accidents near Earth, and when the captain scoffed and threatened consequences, Ortiz replied that Earth traffic control protocols applied equally to all vessels and that any violation would trigger automatic safeguards, a phrase that meant nothing to the Kel until their flagship attempted a minor power surge to assert dominance and found its systems dampened instantly, not disabled entirely but constrained, as if an invisible hand had gently but firmly closed around their reactor output, and the realization spread through the Dominion fleet like a chill. Because this was happening deep in human space, far from the original Lyran incident, which meant the humans were not deploying localized tricks but operating from principles embedded into their entire infrastructure, principles that allowed them to shape the environment itself in ways others could not, and as a Dominion delegation withdrew under the guise of diplomatic recalibration. News of the encounter leaked despite Council efforts to contain it, spreading through trade hubs and border systems where merchants and mercenaries alike began to adjust their routes to avoid human space not out of fear of attack but out of uncertainty, because no one could predict how human systems would interact with their own, and uncertainty was the one thing the galaxy hated most. Meanwhile, within the Council, Spire Speaker Trell Ka convened a closed session of senior representatives, excluding minor species and observers, where the mood was tense and unusually honest as ancient beings who had seen empires rise and fall admitted that the humans had disrupted a balance that had endured for thousands of cycles, not by force but by invalidating assumptions, because every doctrine the Compact relied on was built around escalation, deterrence through overwhelming output, and the belief that conflict could always be measured in ships destroyed and systems conquered. But the humans had demonstrated a form of power that operated beneath that scale, a power that could deny conflict itself. And one delegate from the Voth hierarchy voiced what many were thinking when he said that if humans could choose when wars happened and when they did not, then they effectively controlled the battlefield before it even existed. And this led to the uncomfortable question of why humanity had not used this capability sooner, to which an Orinthal archivist responded by presenting a translated fragment from human history. A speech given centuries earlier by one of their leaders who warned that the most dangerous weapons were those that made war easy, and that restraint was not weakness but discipline. And as the chamber absorbed this, reports arrived that humans were not expanding their protection only to the Lyran, but had quietly begun offering relocation and defense agreements to several vulnerable species along contested borders, not imposing terms but presenting options, and those species, long accustomed to being bargaining chips in larger power struggles, accepted in surprising numbers. Because the humans asked for nothing beyond mutual non-aggression and information sharing, a modest proposal that felt almost suspicious in a galaxy where protection always came at a price, and this growing web of quiet alliances alarmed the major powers more than any fleet movement could have, because influence was shifting without conquest, and Ambassador Grant, summoned once again before the Council, listened as Speaker Trell Ka accused humanity of destabilizing the compact through unilateral action, to which he replied that humanity was stabilizing it by preventing atrocities the Council had chosen to ignore. And when Trell Ka warned that continued interference could lead to sanctions or worse, Grant simply asked what worse meant in practical terms, a question that forced the speaker into an uncomfortable silence, because for the first time the threat of war fell hollow, and as the session adjourned without resolution. Behind the scenes, human analysts noted increased surveillance activity around Earth and its colonies, not overt hostility but preparation, the kind that preceded miscalculation, and so humanity quietly elevated readiness levels, not by mobilizing fleets but by adjusting parameters, loosening constraints that had been in place for centuries, safeguards layered atop safeguards born from humanity's long and painful history of self-inflicted devastation. And as engineers and strategists reviewed protocols that had never been tested outside simulations, a shared understanding spread through human leadership that the galaxy was approaching a tipping point, because the aliens were beginning to realize that humans were not underdogs who had suddenly grown strong, but an old species that had learned to survive itself, and that realization, once fully formed, would either lead to cautious coexistence or desperate escalation, and humanity would prepare for either, even as the rest of the galaxy struggled to comprehend a power that did not announce itself until it was already in control. As tension thickened across compact space, the first real test of whether the galaxy would adapt or panic came not from the great powers, but from a client state desperate to prove relevance. The Sera combined a technologically flashy but strategically shallow polity whose leadership believed that humanity's restraint was a performance meant for larger audiences. And so they chose a human logistics corridor near the unaligned Racksdrift as a stage for a demonstration strike, calculating that a limited assault on unmanned infrastructure would provoke outrage without triggering full retaliation, a classic compact maneuver refined over centuries. And when Seraph Raiders destroyed 3 automated human relay platforms and broadcast triumphant footage of the explosions, the Admiral congratulated themselves on exposing the myth of human untouchability, unaware that the platforms they had hit were not communication hubs but diagnostic nodes, systems designed to monitor stress points in space-time and network behavior under hostile conditions. And within minutes of the attack, Human Command flagged the event not as an act of war but as unsolicited testing, a categorization that shifted response authority away from diplomats and towards system engineers, because in human doctrine anything that interacted with core infrastructure became a technical problem before it was a political one. And the response was swift, quiet, and devastatingly precise as Seraph fleets across 6 systems began reporting cascading failures in navigation coherence, their ships not disabled outright but finding themselves unable to agree on where they were in relation to anything else, formation flying becoming impossible as relative positioning drifted unpredictably, jump calculations refusing to converge, weapons locks failing because targeting solutions could not stabilize. And panic set in as Seraph captains realized they were functionally blind and isolated in the middle of contested space, a condition humans referred to as desynchronization and had spent generations learning to avoid after nearly stranding their own species during early expansion. And when the Sera Combined demanded an explanation, threatening escalation if their systems were not restored, the reply came not from a military channel but from the same civilian liaison office that had unsettled the Dominion, Daniel Ortiz calmly informing them that their fleets were experiencing interference caused by incompatible operational assumptions interacting with human network space, and that restoration would occur automatically once all Seraph vessels powered down weapons, disengaged from contested zones, and acknowledged fault for initiating hostile interaction, terms that were humiliating but offered a clear exit. And while Seraph leadership raged at the idea of public submission, their fleet commanders, facing mutiny from crews who realized they could neither fight nor flee, complied. And as systems stabilized and ships limped home under human-monitored corridors, the wider galaxy took notice, because this was no longer one of anomaly or a lucky trick. It was a repeatable pattern, and analysts began to whisper word that carried ancient dread: domain control, the ability to shape not just battles but the environment in which all battles occurred. A power previously attributed only to hypothetical precursor races long vanished from known space, and now unmistakably human. And within the Council Spire, emergency debates turned openly fearful as delegates argued whether humanity had crossed a line, while others countered that the line had never existed, that humans had simply been playing a different game from the beginning. And Speaker Trell, for the first time since his ascension, authorized the release of restricted Oriental records to gain leverage, only to find that many references to humanity were missing or deliberately obscured, erased during earlier cycles, by archivists who had deemed a pre-industrial species irrelevant, an act that now looked less like negligence and more like a catastrophic blind spot. And as these realizations piled up, a faction within the Council began advocating for preemptive containment, arguing that no species should wield uncontestable environmental power. But this proposal fractured the chamber because no one could define what containment even meant when human systems permeated trade routes, navigation standards, and communication backbones that the galaxy now depended on. And while politicians argued, humans continued their quiet work, reinforcing corridors, expanding protective agreements, and restoring damaged Seraph infrastructure without demanding tribute, an act that confused even their allies, because it looked like mercy rather than domination. But human leadership understood the deeper necessity. That stability bred trust, and trust bought time, and time was what humanity needed as intelligence. Reports confirmed a troubling trend: covert coordination between several major powers, data sharing spikes, fleet exercises near human-adjacent space, all signs of actors who felt the walls closing in and were debating whether to strike before fully understanding what they were striking. And so the question humanity had anticipated from the beginning finally sharpened into focus across the galaxy, not whether humans were powerful, but whether that power could be challenged at all. And as ancient fears resurfaced and alliances strained, the stage was set for a confrontation that would force every civilization in the compact to decide whether to cling to old doctrines or accept that the era of underestimating humanity had already ended. The coalition that formed in the shadows of the Council did not announce itself, because its architects understood that overt declarations would only accelerate human countermeasures they still barely comprehended. And so the effort took shape as a coordination of assumptions rather than fleets, shared intelligence models, synchronized doctrines, and a quiet agreement among the Kel Dominion, the Voth hierarchy, and three lesser powers that if humanity's influence continued unchecked, the old order would dissolve, an outcome intolerable to civilizations built on inherited dominance. And their planners convinced themselves that human power depended on proximity and preparation, that the null shadowing and desynchronization effects required dense infrastructure and could be overwhelmed by sufficient force applied quickly, a belief reinforced by the absence of visible human armadas or superweapons. And so they chose a test that would also be a message, a joint exercise conducted near the human-aligned Tarsi's reach under the pretext of routine maneuvers, massing hundreds of ships and formations optimized for rapid strike, betting that if humans were truly dominant, they would intervene immediately and reveal limits, and if they did not, the coalition could proceed to more aggressive actions with confidence. But the moment the exercise commenced, something subtle began to unravel, not in human space, but within the coalition's own coordination, as shared tactical overlays lagged by fractions of a second, then seconds, then failed entirely, commanders issuing orders that arrived out of sequence, fleet elements responding to outdated data. And the harder they pushed for synchronization, the worse the drift became, because the human systems that underpinned regional navigation timing standards were reacting to the sudden density of hostile assumptions by enforcing consistency, a safety architecture designed long ago to prevent cascading accidents in crowded corridors. And as coalition admirals argued over whose systems were at fault, Human observers logged the event as a spontaneous stress resonance, noting with professional interest how non-human doctrines collapsed when deprived of absolute timing, and it was during this confusion that a single human ship entered the exercise zone, not a battleship or carrier, but a logistics tender with civilian markings, broadcasting a polite advisory that the maneuver posed unacceptable risk to corridor stability and requesting dispersal, a message that infuriated coalition commanders who interpreted it as provocation. And when a Voth cruiser fired a warning shot across the tenders, both the response was not return fire but a shift in local parameters, space itself seeming to thicken as relative motion dampened, ships struggling to maintain acceleration as if pushing through heavy water. And within moments the entire exercise force found itself trapped in a slowly collapsing bubble-constrained movement. Not immobilized, but unable to project power beyond immediate proximity, weapons ranges shortened, sensors blurred, jump calculations invalid, and panic spread as captains realized they could neither fight effectively nor withdraw, and only then did the second human transmission arrive, this one from Ambassador Grant herself, stating that the corridor had entered a protected stability mode due to unsafe activity, and that all vessels would be escorted out once conditions normalized, a statement delivered with the same calm tone she had used months earlier. But now it carried a weight the coalition could no longer dismiss, because this was not retaliation. It was traffic management applied to a military armada, and the humiliation cut deeper than any defeat as the galaxy watched feeds of mighty warships being guided away by unarmed human escorts like wayward freighters, and in the aftermath the coalition fractured under mutual blame. Accusations of technological sabotage and betrayal, flying as leaders scrambled to save face, while within the Council Spire Speaker Trell Ka faced open rebellion from delegates who now argued that continued antagonism was suicidal, and it was here that the Arinthal finally revealed their own fear, admitting in a closed address that their ancestors had once encountered a species like humanity and survived only because that species chose isolation over domination, a choice the Arinthal had mistaken for extinction, and this confession shattered the last illusion of parity, because it reframed humanity not as an upstart but as a survivor of a deeper filter the galaxy had never seen. And as news of the failed exercise spread, smaller powers accelerated their alignment with human protection frameworks, trade routes reoriented, standard committees quietly adopted human protocols, and the balance of power shifted not with a bang but with a series of irreversible administrative decisions, while on Earth human leadership debated how far to let this go. Some arguing that the galaxy was finally learning and should be allowed to adapt, others warning that wounded pride could still drive catastrophic choices, and as readiness parameters were adjusted yet again, Safeguard peeled back another layer, a consensus formed that if a final lesson was coming it would need to be unmistakable, not destructive but definitive, because the time for the galaxy to learn gently was running out, and humanity, never the underdogs they were assumed to be, prepared to show exactly why their restraint had always been the most dangerous thing about them. The definitive moment arrived sooner than human leadership preferred, triggered not by grand strategy but by fear curdling into desperation within the remnants of the coalition, as a hardline faction inside the Kel Dominion concluded that if humanity's control depended on stability, then chaos itself might be the weapon to break it, and so they authorized Operation Scorchwake. A plan as crude as it was reckless that involved detonating chain gravitic disruptors along a densely traveled interstellar junction shared by human-protected species, calculating that mass civilian loss would either force humanity into visible military retaliation or expose the limits of their environmental control, a gamble rooted in the old belief that terror always worked, and when human sensors detected the deployment, the response bypassed council debate entirely. Authority flowing automatically through protocols older than the compact itself, protocol born from a time when humanity had nearly erased its own biosphere and learned the hard way that speed mattered more than permission, and across dozens of system parameters shifted in unison as corridors locked, energy gradients flattened, and the fabric of navigable space entered a state humans called deep coherence, a mode never activated beyond simulations because it carried irreversible consequences. And as the Kel Task Force attempted to trigger their devices, they found that causality itself had narrowed, actions requiring alignment they could no longer achieve, detonation sequences refusing to resolve, command signal collapsing into harmless noise, and then the human response manifested not as a fleet but as an announcement broadcast galaxy-wide. Ambassador Grant's voice steady as she stated that an extinction-level hazard had been prevented and that effective immediately the human network would enforce absolute transit safety across all shared corridors, meaning no vessel could initiate mass casualty actions. Anywhere those corridors extended, a declaration that stunned the galaxy because it was not a threat but a statement of fact, confirmed moments later as pirate raids failed mid-ambush, border skirmishes fizzled into standoffs, and ancient rivalries found themselves unable to escalate past posturing, and in the Dominion the shock turned inward as their own citizens realized their leadership had attempted to provoke annihilation and failed. Not heroically but pathetically, undone by a species they had mocked as soft, and riots erupted demanding accountability. While within the Council, Spire Speaker Trell Ka finally conceded what had been unthinkable, that a compact no longer governed conditions of peace. It merely existed within them, because humanity had done what no empire had ever achieved. They had removed the option of total war without conquering anyone. And as analysts struggled to understand the scope of what had changed, human representatives clarified that this was not occupation or rule. Any species could leave human space and human corridors if they wished, but those corridors now formed the backbone of interstellar movement, and abandoning them meant economic and cultural isolation few could survive, a choice that made the new order effectively voluntary and therefore unstoppable. And in private, Grant met with Trell Ka, who asked why humanity had not taken control outright when they clearly could. And she answered simply that humans had tried ruling each other and found it inefficient, preferring systems that limited the worst outcomes while leaving room for choice, a philosophy born not from idealism but from scars. And as months passed, the galaxy adapted, militaries shrinking as relevance faded, diplomats rising in importance, conflicts resolving through pressure rather than blood. And though resentment lingered, it was tempered by a quiet relief that the age of existential annihilation had ended, enforced not by gods or precursors but by a species that understood restraint and survival. And historians would later mark this period as a moment aliens finally learned the truth, that humans were never underdogs clawing upward. They were veterans of a deeper war who had already faced their own extinction and won, and the galaxy had been living on borrowed assumptions ever since. The long stabilization that followed did not feel like victory to humanity so much as a holding pattern under relentless scrutiny, because while open conflict had become structurally impossible within human-enforced corridors, resentment did not vanish. It reorganized, taking the form of ideological resistance, economic subversion, and quiet refusal among species who had built their identities around the right to wage war. And the most dangerous of these was not the defeated Kel Dominion but a coalition of mid-tier powers calling themselves the Sovereign Continuity, who argue that humanity's safety framework amounted to cultural annihilation, stripping civilizations of the ability to define themselves through struggle, and their rhetoric found sympathetic ears among populations who felt diminished by peace they had not chosen. And so while no fleets mobilized, continuity agents began probing the edges of the human network, exploiting legal gaps, establishing shadow routes, and encouraging unrest in systems newly aligned with human protection, betting that internal fracture would succeed where force had failed. And humanity responded with the same unsettling consistency it had shown from the beginning, not by suppression but by exposure, releasing comprehensive data streams that laid bare the economic manipulation and casualty projections behind continuity talking points, translated into hundreds of languages and distributed freely, a tactic that baffled alien propagandists accustomed to secrecy and narrative control, because humans treated information warfare like sanitation, assuming that transparency reduced long-term harm, and in many systems public support for resistance collapsed under weight of revealed consequences, but not everywhere. And on the border world of Hesk, a mixed species hub with deep cultural ties to ritualized combat, protests escalated into sabotage when a continuity-backed faction attempted to disable a corridor anchor, believing that local disruption would force humans into visible enforcement. And for the first time since Deep Coherence activation, a human safeguard failed, not catastrophically but enough to cause a civilian transport to misjump, stranding thousands in interstitial space, alive but unreachable by non-human rescue methods. And the galaxy held its breath waiting to see what humans would do, because this was a nightmare scenario critics had warned about, human systems breaking and proving fallible. And the response was immediate and profoundly human as every non-essential network throttled down to reroute capacity, colonies accepting temporary isolation without protest, trade volumes collapsing overnight, all to concentrate effort on a rescue that offered no strategic gain. And within hours, human vessels began appearing inside the interstitial pocket, ships designed not for combat but for disaster recovery, carrying crews trained for months in silence and monotony, and over the Course of 2 days, every stranded civilian was recovered alive, an outcome that stunned even human planners because it required pushing their own tolerances to the edge. And when Ambassador Grant addressed the council afterward, she did not accuse or threaten. She explained exactly what had gone wrong, how it had been fixed, and what limits still existed, admitting vulnerability without hesitation. And that admission changed something fundamental, because it reframed human power not as an infallible cage, but as a maintained system that depended on cooperation, and support for the sovereign continuity fractured overnight as populations realized that opposing humanity did not mean reclaiming freedom. It meant reintroducing risks they no longer wanted to bear. And even among the Oriental, a shift occurred as elder strategists conceded that humanity's strength lay not in dominance, but in willingness to accept responsibility at scale, a burden most civilizations avoided. And as reforms rippled outward, corridor governance councils formed with human and alien representation, safety standards codified collaboratively, and the galaxy began to internalize a new definition of power, one measured not by how much force could be applied, but by how much harm could be reliably prevented. And though tensions remained and would for generations, the narrative of humanity as accidental rulers faded, replaced by a quieter understanding that humans were caretakers by grim necessity, a role they had never sought but could not abandon. Because once you have learned how to stop the worst outcomes, choosing not to is just another form of violence, and this realization, more than any display of control, marked the point where even the most stubborn aliens began to accept that humanity's rise had not ended the galaxy's story, it had simply forced it to grow up. The final adjustment came not with crisis, but with choice, a moment historians would later struggle to dramatize because nothing exploded and no fleets moved. Yet everything that mattered settled into place as the council convened one last time on the old compact charter, its authority already hollowed out by reality, and Speaker Trell Ka, ancient and visibly diminished by the weight of adaptation, formally proposed the dissolution of the compact as a governing body and its reformation into a consultative assembly operating within the human corridor framework, a motion that would have been unthinkable a cycle earlier and now passed with weary acceptance rather than applause, because every delegate understood that power had already migrated elsewhere, not to Earth itself, but to the systems humanity had woven so deeply into galactic life that removing them would mean tearing civilization apart. And Ambassador Grant, speaking not as a victor but as a witness, acknowledged the end of an era and reminded the chamber that humanity had no interest in erasing history, only in preventing it from repeating its worst chapters, a sentiment that resonated unevenly but stuck. And in the years that followed, the galaxy did not become peaceful in the sentimental sense. Disputes still flared, cultures still clashed, ambitions still collided. But the shape of conflict changed, channeled into economic pressure, arbitration, controlled competition, and when violence did occur, it was contained, localized, survivable, something to be resolved rather than endured, and humanity slowly stepped back from constant intervention, not because their influence waned but because it had been internalized, corridor standards taught in alien academies, safety doctrines embedded into foreign shipyards, restraint reframed as professionalism rather than weakness, and the phrase never provoked humans faded from common use, replaced by a subtler understanding that humans did not need provoking to matter. They were already present in every assumption about how space worked, and on Earth the story was told more quietly, not as conquest but as a continuation of an old pattern, humans breaking something dangerous, nearly destroying themselves, and then spending centuries building rules strong enough to live with, exporting that hard-won lesson not out of arrogance but exhaustion, because they knew better than anyone how thin the line was between confidence and catastrophe. And when young species asked why humans never ruled outright, elders would explain that absolute power solved nothing humans had not already failed at solving alone, that survival was a shared project whether anyone liked it or not, and so the galaxy moved forward under an unspoken agreement that no one would ever again be allowed to burn everything down just to prove they could. An agreement enforced not by fear of human wrath, but by the memory of how casually humans had removed the option of annihilation without asking for gratitude. And this, more than any battle or declaration, was how the story ended, with aliens finally understanding that humans were never underdogs waiting for their turn. They were veterans of their own worst war who had learned the cost of winning, and decided that making sure no one else ever had to learn it the same way was the only victory that mattered.